Now keep in mind that anything can serve as a medium of realization, a medium of insight, if the mind is clear and serene enough through the discipline of attention, or through the discipline of Zazen, Zen practice. Seeing a finger, hearing a frog jump into a pond, washing one's face, experiencing the sunrise, smelling the flowers, virtually anything can trigger a moment of realization if the mind is clear and receptive, primed and ready to receive the universe as it speaks. So let's look at Basho's most famous haiku, "The old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of the water." Now this is without question Basho's most famous and popular haiku that he ever wrote. "The old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of the water." It is the best known of all of his poems, and it was written when he was 42 years old. And in it we see evidence that he was coming into his own as a mature poet, and that his poetry was starting to bear the imprint of Zen Buddhism. There are many different translations of this poem, and here I'll share with you a couple of those. "Breaking the silence of an ancient pond, a frog jumped into water, a deep resonance." That translation fills out a lot more with extra words. It's a little bit more wordy. It's actually the one that is in the reading that I gave you. Another translation, "Old pond, a frog leaps in, water's sound." And then the translation that I just read. Now, why is this poem remarkable? What makes it so famous? It seems rather short, trivial, and insignificant on its surface. Well, Basho wrote the poem while he was deeply immersed in meditation, and in the midst of meditation, he could hear the sound of the frogs jumping into the water. And he comes out of that meditative state within the second half of the poem. And in the process, the poem achieves a rich symbolism without any pretension to being symbolic. On the surface, the poem describes the simple action of a frog and its after effects. But upon reflection, the action of the frog leaping into the old pond is not merely an external action, but it exists internally in Basho's mind, and the pond becomes a mirror that is held up to reflect the author's mind. So this is a really good example where the distinction between the surface and core of a poem, or the ka and jitsu of the poem, as I talked about in a previous lecture, can help us to see that on the surface, what's being reflected in this poem becomes a symbol or begins to reflect the deeper resonance of something more metaphysical or something deeper. So let's focus on the last translation of this famous poem, and let's try to close read it. Not by analyzing its meaning, but rather by analyzing its parts and associations, peeling back the various layers of the poem, how its surface, its ka, reflects a deeper essence, its jitsu, and how both of these exist not in the poet or in nature, but rather in the fusion between them. "The old pond, a frog jumps in, the sound of the water." The first line sets the scene, the old pond. It is likely a large, perhaps overgrown lily pond in a public garden, and then the frog acts as our cue. Now, old is an important cue word as well, because old or ancient implies that Basho is sitting next to an old mossy pond. It also connects the pond to ancient tradition as well. And this is the first indication that Basho is presenting his own mind as a timeless, endless pond, serene and potent, but also old in itself, connected to tradition, the tradition of others. It is quiet, ready to absorb and reflect that which happens to it. This is a condition that is very familiar to those who practiced Zen Buddhism. Now, Basho, therefore, is lost in a state of attention, a state of intense concentration achieved through meditation. He's absorbed into the fundamental unity of the pond. And when you devote yourself into that absorption, moment by moment, that is often referred to as a state of samadhi, or a state of consciousness in which the mind becomes a mirror to the movements and voice of the reality around you. The mind becomes, in other words, like a clear water or a serene lake. And when the mind is like this, anything can serve as a brief moment of satori, or enlightenment. So the frog jumps in and calls to mind the sound of the frog, plop. And while it is not stated here, plop, in the Japanese translation, it is implied, and the sound plop is onomatopoeic, It presents the action by its sound. So the frog becomes the sound, the song of plop. And the poet's mind reflects that sound transparently. And as a result, the poet becomes intimate with the sound, hearing it and realizing it in his mind. A well-known parody of this poem is revealing in this respect. The old pond, Basho jumps in, the sound of the water. That's a funny poem, right? Because it shows you what's funny about it is Basho's jumping into the pond, right? But what's actually truthful and reflective here is that in a weird way, Basho is jumping into the sound of the water. His mind is reflecting the sound of the water in this famous poem. And a final interesting point about this poem is its grammatical ambiguity, which Basho uses to great effect. The enjambment at the end of the second line allows the poem to be read in two different ways. It makes a frog leaps in seem like a complete sentence, but then again, it's also part of a larger grammatical whole. In other words, read the first way, we have old pond, a frog leaps in, and then the result, water's sound. But when we read it a second way, the meaning shifts. Old pond, a frog leaps in water's sound. In other words, old pond, the sound of the water a frog leaps into. So the frog is leaping into the sound of the water. The action of the frog jumping is indistinguishable from the sound of the water. And this merging of the action of the frog into the action of the sound becomes a moment that Basho realizes in his mind, reflects in this haiku, and through that reflection, he allows his poem to allow the universe to speak through its simple actions and simple sounds.